I think the broken part of the system is that there's no incentive for contractors to have to raise the bar. It's okay for builders to build to the code, and when it doesn't work, somebody else, after they pay their deductible, is picking up the pieces.
Welcome to the Construction Disruption Podcast, where in just about 30 minutes a week, we uncover the future of building and remodeling. Join us as we explore an industry that is constantly evolving, constantly changing with new products, new practices, and new technologies. From builders to remodelers to executives, as well as those with outside perspectives, each episode of the Construction Disruption Podcast meets with forward thinkers as well as those in the know in order to share their unique insights. Construction Disruption is created and sponsored by Isaiah Industries, a manufacturer of specialty metal roofing systems and other building materials. My name's Todd Miller with Isaiah Industries, and today our co-host is our sales manager, Seth Heckerman. Our producer today is Ryan Bell, who's behind the scenes here. Seth, before we get started with our special guest today, who is Derek Hodgin of Construction Science and Engineering in Westminster, South Carolina, tell me a little bit about what perhaps you see as a major change confronting the $1.3 trillion construction industry right now, and maybe a way in which you see a company or companies trying to meet that change, or maybe it's a change that you don't see anyone trying to meet at all. I don't know. Share a little bit about that.
Thanks, Todd. I think it's really interesting and what we're seeing across the industry that I'm not sure how many people are paying much attention to right now is the amount of investment in our industry coming from outside the industry. Whether private equity or otherwise, whether as on the manufacturing level or on the retail level, there's a significant amount of investment coming in. And these investors are seeing an opportunity in a profitable business. They're seeing an opportunity in an industry that is probably primed for disruption and trying to figure out ways to do that. We've seen Katerra. They've come up on a couple other episodes on the podcast so far. I think we saw numbers like $3.5 billion worth of investment went into that operation that unfortunately ended up folding not too long ago. We've seen other startups coming out of Silicon Valley and other places of seeing that we've been building the same way for a long, long time, and there's got to be some improvements, some better ways to be doing that. When we're talking with contractors and paying attention on the contractor level in markets all across the country, we're seeing similar things where huge private equity groups are buying up previously, just individual market or regionally based retail operations, again, seeing it as a profitable venture, and whether keeping those brand names or bundling them all under some national brand, it's definitely significant change rather than the corner, downtown corner type of contractor now turning into these nationwide conglomerates. So we'll see if they are willing to put up with some of the headaches that come from on the retail level. And yes, it can be profitable, but there's also, when it comes to installation and skilled labor shortage and dealing with homeowners, but it's significant change. And so how it really comes back to the theme and purpose of construction disruption of, okay, other people are seeing this prime to be disrupted. We need to be thinking in an innovative way, a proactive way of opportunities for advancement. Otherwise, people from outside are going to come and eat our lunch. So let those of us who love and are invested in this industry be the ones to innovate rather than bankers or lawyers from hedge funds or hipsters in Silicon Valley. So that's why I'm excited about what we're doing, these conversations we're having.
Very interesting. Good stuff. I remember a couple of years ago, you and I were at the IRE show, the roofing show, and I think I commented to you that where did all the hipsters come from? Because you just didn't see them in our industry 5 years ago. And really, it was cool. It's very neat to see the fresh ideas, the fresh thinking, the outside the box thinking, the disruptive thinking that some of these folks are bringing into our industry. I mean, we certainly want them to keep the levels of quality, the levels of safety, the levels of caring for people up. But it is neat to see some of the stuff that's going on. So, and provides opportunities for all of us, like you said.
Absolutely.
Good stuff. Well, thank you. Our guest today on Construction Disruption is, like I mentioned earlier, Derek Hodgin of Construction Science and Engineering. Derek's based in Westminster, South Carolina. He's a registered professional engineer, registered in several states. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from North Carolina State University. Derek works a lot with facility condition inspections, failure analysis, damage assessments, and forensic engineering investigation of all types of structures. He provides expert testimony in litigation for deficient construction cases as well as personal injury cases. He's performed engineering assessments of hurricanes, tornado, hail, wind, ice, and fire-related damages for commercial and residential structures. When he's not providing expert engineering or delivering dynamic presentations, Derek enjoys spending time and traveling with his wife and children. I've also heard something about what I think is every young guy's dream, a vintage orange Volkswagen bus someplace there in your activity as well. So that's cool. But over the years, I've worked with Derek for the design and specification of wind-resistant metal roof systems. And we also, I remember, worked once on failure analysis of a fire-treated lumber project. I know that he loves working with coastal projects of all types and likes diving and all those things. And he's also performed analysis of a lot of EFIS jobs as well as hardboard siding and trim failures and projects as well. Realistically, there's probably no one I know of who's more in the know than Derek when it comes to the performance of building materials and construction practices. This is a guy who has seen systems perform and systems fail, and when they fail, he's doggedly determined to figure out why they fail. So that is why I figure he knows the future of construction better than pretty much everyone, because he's seen what doesn't work, and he knows what needs to be done differently going forward. So, Derek, thank you again for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and to learn from you. Curious, out of the huge number of projects and things you've worked with in your 30-plus years and the various things you've done from failure analysis to engineering on new projects, what is it you most enjoy that you get to do?
I think it's really perfect timing for the train to go by with the first question. But I'd say it's opportunities like this to share what I've learned with the industry and try to help people build better. We have a number of articles that we've written and a lot of seminars that we've delivered and so forth. And even in litigation, when I get the opportunity to testify in trial or most often in a deposition, you get to be a teacher of construction issues. And so I get to teach about the subjects that I love to look at and investigate. And I learn, if I'm doing a good job, I'm learning something on most every case that I get engaged with. So.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, that's got to be pretty fascinating, the wide variety of projects and things that you run into. I remember a number of years ago, you and I were both looking at a mansard roof failure on an apartment project on Hilton Head Island. I think it was a project that the locals affectionately, or maybe not affectionately, called Stack-a-Shacks. But it was on that project that really you taught me about fire-treated plywood, which I was a little bit familiar with and had run into decking failures. But you also taught me a lot about fire-treated dimensional lumber and the failures that occurred with corrosion introduction of fasteners and various fastening plates and things. I'm curious, are you still, just out of my curiosity, are you still seeing failures out there with the fire-treated plywood and lumber, or has most of that kind of worked its way through the system as it is?
Well, I'd say most of it's kind of worked itself out. I mean, as building failures, related to that product are identified, and then roof systems replaced, a lot of that stuff has gone away. But it's interesting that you asked the question now, since I just recently have a new 2 or 3 cases. There's 2 commercial buildings near the middle of the country, and then one down here in the Carolinas that I've been contacted about recently. I think they must be older, I'll say, recipes of FRT. That's the there's a certain time period, say from the mid 60s into the late 80s, where that product had the most aggressive reaction with wood and caused the most significant amount of strength loss. The industry rebounded from the troubles that, the problems that we learned about through all this litigation and failures. And they've not only changed the recipe to be less aggressive in terms of the reactions with the wood, but also be more realistic about strength loss expectations that engineers have to use in our analysis of roof framing systems.
Gotcha. So there's always a certain amount of strength loss you kind of expect to happen, but then, of course, the cases where it's way out of proportion and not. Are the current FRT systems, you have pretty good confidence in those? We're not seeing problems or issues?
Yes, I've testified many times that current FRT products are a viable product to address fire retardancy with no expected problems with strength loss. As you mentioned, you just have to know what to expect from the product and design for that anticipated, less significant strength loss.
Gotcha. Interesting. I know that, in the construction industry for a number of years now, failures with what we call EFIS systems, exterior insulation finishing systems, those have been in the news for a few years, and now we're starting to hear a few rumblings of problems with some hardboard siding applications, also even with the sheathing systems that have the pre-applied underlayment. I'm curious, when you run into such problems with that, how often or what percentage of the problems you see seem to be inherent to the product compared to misuse or poor application of the product? Is there a distinction there?
Oh, absolutely. In each case, I'm specifically asked to try to delineate, between those issues. And actually, probably the best way to describe it would be with what is called MDF, medium density fiberboard. Manufacturers don't like calling it that because nobody would want to put medium density fiberboard on the outside of their house. So we call it engineered composite siding and engineered composite trim, but it's medium density fiberboard, and it is vulnerable to moisture problems. And so early on, when I would start seeing problems with those products, I could typically find some manufacturer installation instruction that was not satisfied or not met. And when I'd be asked about, is that product defective, I would be reluctant to identify it as defective because it didn't have a fair chance if it wasn't installed properly. Gotcha. Only after I started seeing product failures with no obvious violation of the code or the installation instructions did I come to the opinion that some of these products, particularly earlier on products, I considered to be defective. They were just not satisfactory for their intended use. It would be a wholesale failure, but they soak up water, they swell, they delaminate, and some of the earlier products that are no longer on the market would just have just a terrible time with typical construction details. The products were just not holding up. We've gotten better, but I still think those products are a use with caution type of product, and not just follow manufacturer's instructions, but actually follow what we refer to as better or best practices.
I know you and I spoke a little bit recently, and you had mentioned to me about, that importance of going above and beyond maybe what code requires or what minimum requirements are from the manufacturer in order to make sure that things are going to perform. How does a contractor go about figuring out what those things are that they should do?
Turns out there might be a book around sometime that will tell them how to do that. I'm working on a book. It's called More Than 100 Ways to Build Better, a contractor's field guide to better practices. But right now, there is no such comprehensive document in one place. The Journal of Light Construction has a manual of best practices that they've published around a little early 2000s, I think. But it's a large format book, not something easily carried into the field, and something you have at your office desk, not something at the site. So that's probably the best one I know of. It addresses many areas of construction. Other than that, you're really looking at a lot of individual industry standards. Like for roofing, you'd have NRCA. For metal roofing, the Metal Building Manufacturers Association has that good red, design manual. You've got, ARMA shingles. Right. So there's all these individual documents that you can look at, but no good, comprehensive book that contractors can turn to.
Yeah.
Excited for your book. Absolutely. I'm curious, just because I think a lot of people listening are going to be really curious with how popular, those hardboard siding products are becoming. Any quick hit, 1, 2, 3 things that you've seen that are ways contractors can go above and beyond for installing those in a more foolproof method?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a siding standpoint, it doesn't matter. I'll just say as a exterior wall standpoint, I teach all the time about the 4 Ds of exterior wall design, which are drainage, deflection, drying, and durability. And so drainage or deflection just means keep the water off the wall, have a significant roof overhang so the wall doesn't get wet. Once you accept the fact that the wall is going to get wet, you want to have the water get off your building as quickly as possible. That's the drainage part. So on balconies and flashing, you always want to have a significant slope to manage the water and tell it where to go, and that's away from the building. And then the third, drying is like for a siding application. That would be putting in a batten system or some type of a decoupling device to keep the siding off of your WRB or your wall sheathing. So you want the water to have the easiest path so that it can fall out from behind the siding. You can imagine when you have an intimate exterior wall with, say, 7/16" OSB, some engineered WRB, and then the siding intimately attached. Every one of those attachment points is a dam that is going to restrict the water from migrating down the wall due to gravity.
Sure.
And so, and the siding has some absorptive property that it's going to soak up some water and hold the water against the WRB. And so those are points. They might not result in significant rot or damage, but they're points where the water is held in the wall against some moisture-sensitive products, and you can have localized damage. The last one is durable, and that just means the wall is going to get wet. You're going to try to exit the water as quickly as possible, but everything that the water touches along its path to get off of your building needs to be durable. And so a good example is medium density fiberboard is not necessarily durable, particularly the trim products. The manufacturer would have some unreasonable statement in their instructions to say, don't let the trim get wet. it's on the outside of a building, and typical construction practices, it's going to get wet. The trick is don't let it stay wet. You need to seal the cut ends of the trim. They don't require that. Most of the time, they can have a butt joint with the trim and then just paint, just the exposed surfaces. You want to make sure those concealed cuts are sealed so you don't get water wicking into those joints. That's where it swells up and causes problems. So there's certainly some tricks to make it last longer than it would if you just followed the code and the manufacturer instructions.
This is the perfect example of the bigger picture conversation you're wanting to get in with Derek, of going above and beyond, because we're selling, 6-figure projects of hardboard siding out there, and your butt joints on your trim could bring everything down a few years from now.
Yeah, interesting. Are there any other more recent products or practices you're seeing fairly new to the scene that you have concerns about, or maybe are already seeing issues with? And again, maybe it's because they're particularly vulnerable to not being installed right, but just curious if there's anything you see out there people should be keeping their eyes on.
Well, there are, and I would kind of lump them into this category of what I call silver bullet kind of products. And it's always this, what happens over the course of my career, whenever we try to make things faster or cheaper and we combine products together, you're going to compromise in some way. And in the past, early stucco days, I remember paperback lath. Instead of going up the wall with a nice, heavy 30-pound asphalt-saturated felt, and then going up the wall again with a nice, self-furring lath, and then doing the stucco, paperback lath was this one-step, product where you had a thin paper over some pretty thin lath, and both of those components were lesser components. That was one problem. I mean, that paper by itself was not as moisture resistant as a piece of 30-pound felt, or it used to be 30-pound felt, number 30 felt, I guess now. But the bigger problem with that was, instead of lapping everything in a sequence like they would do when they would go up the wall previously, when you've got the two components together, you had to separate the paper from the lath, and you'd have to have a paper to paper lap, and then a lath to lath lap. I don't know if that makes sense. And they didn't do that. They would go up the wall, and the paper from the next course would partially cover the lath of the previous course, and you'd see these cracks develop. And then when you figure it out, and you're in the field, and you could measure these linear horizontal cracks every 27.5 inches, you knew before you even did your destructive test, it was going to be paperback lath with an incorrect lap. I mean, so as an old example, I'd say a current example of a silver bullet product are some of these exterior wall sheathing products with an integral moisture protection layer, with the attempt to exclude the need for a WRB. And I would just say the idea, I'm intrigued. I think it's good to have a more moisture resistant exterior wall sheathing, but I would caution against using those products in the way that they're marketed to be used, all by themselves, with simply just taping joints. In addition to a WRB, you could create a more robust, durable wall system, but all by themselves, and to count on tapes to keep the water out. And the other thing I'm dealing with right now on a case is, whenever that sheathing is penetrated, beyond the surface, and say you have an overdriven nail, and the face of that sheathing is the drainage plane, every time that there's a pocket, for the water to fall into, it can fall into those pockets, and you could have corrosion of the nail head. You could, if the nail is overdriven enough, you might have a path for water to penetrate and cause damage to the wall sheathing. So there's definitely some cautionary, things that you need to consider when using those products, and still try to incorporate better practices and just know the limitations.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So I when I think of you out on a forensic investigation of a failure or something, I think of you as being the Sherlock Holmes of construction or something. But I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the steps you take when you're doing an investigation like that? I remember, one of the things when we were on that project with the FRT product, you had sent some things off to Clemson, I think, for testing. But, what are some of the typical things that you do on investigations?
Well, it's hard to say just one particular series or the steps that we're taking, because every case is going to be unique in terms of what my role is, what I'm asked to do, what the problem is, what I'm, being asked to investigate. So, obviously on the defense side, I could be an expert witness for the general contractor, and there's claims made about the performance of the building, and I would need to respond to every single claim that's being made. Or if I'm a developer or perhaps an architect, if I'm a subcontractor and I'm just the siding installer, I'm just the window installer, I'm just the roofer, it depends on, what my role is, what the steps are to be taken. But I guess the most basic way I could say is to understand the allegations that are being made, what the performance issues are. And then you compare the as-built conditions with what we call collectively as the contractor's instructions, which would be the building code, the plans and specs, the manufacturer's instructions, and accepted industry standards. Whatever's in print at the time of the construction that was available to the contractor to follow, and the general rule of thumb is, the most stringent applies. How does the as-built condition deviate from those instructions? And is that deviation, is that the proximate cause of the performance problem or the failure or the damage?
Gotcha. Interesting. Switching gears a little bit, this is kind of a painful thing still for us to even think about because it's all so fresh in our minds, but the recent collapse of the Surfside condominium project and building is certainly going to go down as one of our country's most tragic building failures. Certainly a difficult example of what can go wrong and why good design and maintenance are critical. I'm curious if you have any feedback yet on, what might have happened there, and also curious, do you think that our country has a lot of potential projects that, could result in something similar to that, or do you think that hopefully will go down as being a pretty unique situation?
Well, I certainly hope it's not going to be a pattern. It's certainly a sad situation, and it's a big loss. I'm not engaged currently on that project. I do have some colleagues that are familiar with some of the issues. So I think if we talk, just from the generic sense of what has been reported about that case, one theme that I'm probably the most familiar with is doing a property condition assessment or some type of engagement with an HOA on an oceanfront condominium of multiple stories of concrete, finding water intrusion issues, corroded rebar, necessary repairs that could lead, if not corrected, could lead to structural, compromise. But then, once you write the report and you are making these recommendations, unless there's an immediate concern, I mean, you have a duty as an engineer to protect the welfare and safety of the public. I would have to report something to the local authority having jurisdiction and to the HOA to shut a building down if I had the highest level of concern. But if it's just normal, things that can still be repaired and the building can continue to be occupied, you're just providing a report to educate the HOA on what repairs are needed, but you can't force them to spend money. And the problem is, many times our reports are recommending multi-million-dollar concrete repairs. And that's a difficult thing for some HOAs to swallow, and they're not quick to, either they've got the proper reserves in place and they can absorb a decent sized project, or they're going to have to assess themselves to come up with an adequate.
Well, certainly tragic, that's for sure. So I'm curious if there's a young person out there just maybe interested in construction or engineering or building science, what advice would you give to them, maybe as fields that would be good to go into going forward, or just things to pay attention to or think about as they kind of plan out their career path?
Well, I'm pretty biased, but I would highly recommend forensic engineering because it teaches you probably the quickest and best, it's probably the most efficient way to learn, what works and what doesn't. Even if you didn't make a full career out of doing forensic work or investigations, if you spent a year or two doing this type of activity before you became a designer, your designs would be so much more thoughtful about, what to expect and things to kind of safeguard your design against. And that's why I'm not the most efficient designer, because I'm probably a little more on the anal side of getting everything exactly the way I want. And I'll just say this, I know I'm in a special situation, but I don't put my designs out to bid to contractors. I pre-select and pre-qualify a small number of both manufacturers and contractors for my work. And so I don't think everybody has that luxury, but if I'm going to be the designer, I try to help the owner find just a few contractors to submit our design to for estimating or bidding purposes.
I think that context that you're seeing, that you're talking about, seeing the real world application after the years out in the field and what the result has been, that was something I picked up on your conversation earlier about the integrated lath and paper and the other examples you gave, that the manufacturer had designed this product and given explicit instructions for how it was to be installed to avoid that issue. And, ultimately, though, out in the field, it wasn't being done that way. And it doesn't sound like something egregious or something a horrible dereliction of duty on the contractor's part. That's just how it ended up manifesting in the field, and some real world considerations. You need to have kind of both sides of that coin and understand how it's going to flow all the way through. And I think that's something for all of us to keep in mind, especially, it keeps coming up on every episode of construction disruption, skilled labor shortage, pressed for time, trying to get things done, keeping that context of every step through the process and what that's going to mean for the building owner ultimately.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was the fact that maybe someone coming out of college would go into forensics first and then design. I would have almost guessed it would have to be the other way, that you have to start in design and go into forensics, later if you wanted to. But that certainly makes a lot more sense, and I can see how that would make for a much more thoughtful designer if you spent some time in forensics first. Very interesting.
Well, I guess I should clarify and say you would be able to do forensic investigations right out of school, kind of as an apprentice or a mentee, mentor program. You're not going to probably be testifying, in a trial or a deposition as the subject matter expert. But certainly, I mean, we've had a pretty active engineering co-op program at our firm. And I mean, the kids that come through here are just blown away by how much, goes into an investigation and a report, and how many things are just overlooked, in construction. And exactly what we were just talking about. Have the instructions at the job site is a pretty basic thing, and have it in the language of the person who's doing the work that they can understand it, and make sure that it's provided to every person that's doing the work. And there's some example of a proper installation, whether it's a mock-up or the first, window install, or the first area of one type or aspect of the work is there as an example that the contractors can follow throughout the course of the project, instead of having everybody kind of doing their own thing. There's some pretty basic stuff that we could do to improve our work habits that just aren't being done. I think you were right when you said it just seems like it's just schedule and budget. Those are the two driving factors. How fast can we do it and make a profit? Unfortunately, I guess depends on how you look at it. I mean, good for me that we mess things up enough that I have more than enough work, but it's kind of sad that we can't slow down and follow instructions and build things a little bit better.
I know on the roofing side of things, I'm seeing a few large national roofing companies that really have what I think are tremendously good training programs and really are investing a lot in their teams. Also on the roofing side, National Roofing Contractors Association has started their pro certification program, which I think is very promising as well. In general, though, I mean, with the labor shortage that we are fighting in the construction industry, do you generally think the quality of work is going up or down, or just kind of riding a wave where it generally stays about the same over time?
I feel like things are taking a turn for the worse. I mean, I don't see things now. I don't want to be the bad guy. I have a very skewed perspective. Nobody calls me and says, "Hey, come and look at my building that works."
It's so great, yeah.
All I'm looking at is stuff that's got a problem. So keep that in mind when I'm talking, is that all I'm seeing is the bad examples. But I will just say this. When I first started doing this 30 years ago, it would be people making mistakes because they didn't know any better. It was just things just didn't work out, and it was unfortunate, and there was a performance problem. Now, it seems like, and I don't want to say this is throughout the industry, it just seems like we're so driven on money and schedules that there is just egregious. I mean, the examples of the stuff I could show you and how bad it is. It just blows me away. I mean, still, and it's hard to surprise me anymore. But I have a case we just settled on a mid-rise wood frame apartment building where the framer goofed up the framing, and the framing had lateral offsets in the wall framing that were between 1 and 2 inches, right? And so somehow the framer thinks that's okay, and he leaves the job as if he's done, and he's satisfied with the work he just delivered to the general contractor. The next guy comes and he puts his WRB over this completely uneven wall and doesn't say to the general contractor, "Hey, you're not ready for me to put my work on yet because this wall is out of plumb. It has these offsets." So now he accepts the unacceptable conditions that were presented to him and proceeded to do his work without any correction. Then the siding guy comes. He's going to put his siding on, and they put this fiber cement board panel over this huge void with no support. And then so the symptom later when I was looking at it was a huge crack in the wall because there was no support behind the wall. I actually missed a step it was an intersection with a balcony, and there was an area where some self-adhered flashing was supposed to go around this balcony and cover some of the framing. There was missing wall sheathing, and the guy with the self-adhered flashing put the self-adhered flashing over the wall sheathing onto the studs where there was no wall sheathing. So there's like 3 or 4 subcontractors, each visited the site, saw the poor work of the previous guy, did their work, and left. And it's like the what we're accepting, is just unbelievable. That's okay to not do a good job.
You've mentioned it a few times, and that example is on the most egregious end of it. But and I got a little heads up on your and Todd's conversation earlier. But you using this phrase "building better." But when Todd was giving me a heads up, I was surprised that for you that includes building better, even above building code in any given area for the most part. So we hear contractors all the time critiquing our installation instructions, talking about other manufacturers. I have my own way of doing this and doing it better, and them wanting to share those tips and tricks. But at least in the conversations I'm having, building code is just about gospel, especially when we're seeing it just continue to become more stringent and have higher bars that are supposed to be met. But if you could talk a little bit more about that and your perspective on that, because I think it's important context to keep in mind.
Well, I guess we should have another conversation sometime, and you can tell me how the building code is raising the bar. I testify all the time that the building code is the absolute worst building that you can build legally and get away with it. It's the least you can do. It's the bare minimum. It's the floor. You should never aspire to be at the floor. You should always aspire to be above that. And it's just meeting the code that is resulting in these performance problems. And then when there's cases where you can actually meet the code and walk away and think that you've done okay, but then still have durability issues. I mean, just because flashing is installed, if it's not installed with a slope, a more generous lap with some butyl sealant in between and supported, it's not going to work long term. And so the code has just the most basic requirements that, like I said, if it's just the code that we're making the goal, we're always going to have problems. So that's why I think, and I try to avoid the term best practices because that's a moving target. I mean, what's the best practice today might be something different, next week or next year, but better practices than what the code requires. And, in the IBC, commercial projects that we get involved with, that's a performance-based code. It doesn't provide you or the contractor with the means and methods by which you accomplish this durability intent, or the exterior walls shall provide weather protection. I mean, that's the requirement. That's the performance requirement, but it doesn't tell you how to flash and how to integrate WRBs and waterproofing and balcony slopes and all this other stuff. So it starts at the design level, but it's got to be communicated. The designers really need to design things that are above the code, to kind of initiate this movement toward building things that are going to actually last a while.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know that, we as a manufacturer, really have some intense, detailed instructions on how to install our products. Well, obviously, none of that stuff is determined by building code, but we see it as our responsibility as a manufacturer to document and teach and train the absolute most that we know to do. And you're right, best is always a moving target. But we try to teach and train the best that we possibly know today. And yet we still, see people a lot of times, as we were saying, driven by either lack of training or driven by trying to save a few bucks, not hitting those levels. That's for sure.
Yeah.
What are some of the things, as we look forward at construction, over the next 20 years, 25 years, what are some of the things you see as primary driving factors that will help force us to be better and to do better at what we're doing? And that's kind of a nebulous question, I understand, as I ask it, but I'm just kind of curious. I mean, what is it that you do think will force designers, builders, everyone, the trades to be better?
Well, again, just keep in mind that I have a unique perspective of looking at just failures and most often in the context of litigation, when I'm dealing with attorneys and insurance companies and so forth. And so right now, I think the broken part of the system is that there's no incentive monetarily for contractors to have to raise the bar. It's okay for designers to just design to the code, builders to build to the code, and when it doesn't work, somebody else, after they pay their deductible, is picking up the pieces and paying the multi-million-dollar claims. And so until you can incentivize, designers and contractors to raise the bar, and maybe there's a program like, if you're familiar, IBHS, the Institute for Building and Home Safety, has the Fortified program. And so if you're a homeowner and you meet these higher standards, you get an insurance rebate. If there's a way that you can incentivize a contractor or a designer to say, hey, if you would put a drainage mat, behind your siding, or decouple your wall so you've got better drainage. If you can show us you're using a 1/2 inch per foot slope on your roof instead of a 1/4 inch per foot slope, so you don't have a predictable ponding problem. That's another discussion we can have later.
Yeah,
why a 1/4 inch per foot is not a good idea. Maybe there's some kind of way you can get some points or some benefit out of a better design. I don't know the answers. I just know that there's got to be a way that each of us in the industry have a little bit more skin in the game, or a consequence if we continue to build things that are not working or not durable. We don't eliminate all those, so I've got some stuff to look at. But we've got to do a little bit better and make things last, so that we're not having to replace buildings so quickly. And I think another thing, like you were talking about with the Florida situation, it's not completely like, I don't want to talk about politics, but I mean, our infrastructure, I used to do a lot more civil type engineering work, and I was a mayor for a while. I know all about having to replace roads and water supply lines and sewer lines and electrical distribution, and we just have an aging, infrastructure, and the building, our building inventory is in a similar state. And we've got some of those facade inspection programs from the buildings with the steel and the masonry from the 20s to 40s, and some of these urban areas like Boston and New York have those facade inspection ordinances. Maybe that's going to be something that comes out of this Florida situation. Is if a condo is reinforced concrete and it's within so many feet or miles from the open hurricane coastline, maybe there's a certain frequency of property condition evaluation that has to be done to make sure we're on top of the maintenance and the repairs that are needed, so we don't have another disaster.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you. We've it's been great sharing and talking today and catching up a bit. Is there anything we haven't covered that maybe you were hoping we'd cover today?
No, I think we've hit the highlights, but certainly there's lots to talk about. So if there's if you have other subjects that you want to revisit sometime, I'm happy to join you again, and we can hone in on just roofs or just windows or just walls or just balconies. I mean, take your pick. It's there's a long track record.
That'd be a really good idea. We will have to do that. We will do that in future episodes and come back to you a few times. And I like that idea of just, focusing on particular areas and talking more in depth. And it reminds me a little bit of the JLC approach too. I'm glad you mentioned them because I agree they do some good work. So, and very much looking forward to your book, 100 Ways to Build Better. I think that's awesome, and I really was serious when I mentioned earlier to you when we were talking that that'd be a great thing for us to be able to buy and give to our customers as a Christmas gift or something once it's available. So, sounds fantastic. Well, thank you very much for spending some time with us today. How would people get in touch with you if they need to get in touch with you for some reason?
Probably the best way would just be my email, which is just my name, Derek, Derek, Hodgin, Hodgin, at constructionscience.org, O-R-G.
Okay, great. And folks are always welcome to contact me, and I'll be happy to make the introduction to you as well, Derek,
Sure.
also. So thank you again for spending time with us. This has been very interesting, and you always have some great stories, and we will get together again soon as well. So it was great spending some time with Derek. I mean, I think it's really interesting the types of projects and types of analysis that he gets into, and interesting too, where he says, I want everything to get better, but not too good because then I won't have anything to do, and it makes some sense. But I just, I've been involved with some things with him over the years, and he's so scientific in his approach and so exacting in his approach. And, it really goes back to something we've talked about before here on construction disruption, is that importance of health and safety. And I think he wears that very close to his heart and very important to him. And so one of the things he was describing to us was a wall failure, and he was talking about how the building got framed wrong, and then every step of the way, the next trade came in and just covered it up, even though it messed up what they were doing too. And, it got me to thinking, and I think you and I both ran into this before, every one of those trades would have said, if you would have asked them, well, why in the world didn't you say something? They would have said, well, I wouldn't have gotten paid. It would have delayed everything. And so I think that's pretty interesting to think about how the dollars drives things. But then at the end, and I'm curious, maybe we could talk a little bit about what this could look like. But there at the end, Derek comes back and says, well, one of the ways to fix all of this would be to give monetary incentive for better design, better building, better trades, all that type of stuff. I wonder what that would look like, though.
Yeah, it definitely interesting perspective, and Derek sees the dark underbelly of construction more than most of us, or like he said, that's what he's seeing most of the time. And don't want to make it sound like we're just ragging on the contractor in their role in some of these failures. There's plenty of product failures on the manufacturing end of products that never should have gone to market either. And kind of like what we talked about, like with some of the exterior sheeting with the integrated underlayment or house wrap, an overdriven nail caused a failure. So yes, the contractor was the one that hammered the nail, but there's going to be overdriven nails probably in most applications. So just understanding what the real world application is going to be. And, it's not that the contractor needed to get paid at the expense of the homeowner and looking for any opportunity to get extra money. He had shown up to that job. That's the job he was going to install that day, and he had another job to install the next day. And with the labor shortage we talk about all the time, right now we're dealing with a finite amount of install capacity, and they're having to make the most of it. So definitely it's going to be interesting. I think we were talking a little bit at the end of our conversation. Derek alluded to the role of insurance in the process, and a lot of times insurance is paying for some of these, the one footing the bill for these failures. They're getting tired of footing the bill. We're seeing it in our residential space frequently of, dramatically increasing premiums, increasing deductibles up to 2, 3, 4% of home value in very high home value areas. Named storm exclusions, talking with our customer down in Louisiana last week, where they had a major hurricane last year, but only a small percentage of his business over the last year has been paid for by insurance because named storm exclusions meant that homeowners were left still paying. So insurance getting out of the business of paying for construction projects, that could be the first domino here of forcing everyone, end consumer, driving the motivation up that I only want to have to pay for this once too. Yeah. What are the products? Who are the contractors I can trust to do that? What are the products I can trust to be installed to accomplish that?
Yeah, I think it's, really what it's going to take is it's going to take a commitment to quality every step of the way. And, as I listen to Derek and think about this, and I think about the onus on us as a manufacturer and other manufacturers to not only produce great products, but to also produce and provide great training on how our products to be used and installed. But then it's every step from there. I mean, it's the design, it's the trades, it's the contractors, the GC. I hate to say it, but the stakes are high. Even the property owner needs to keep an eye on things and be able to watch things as well. And as I think about young folks out there getting involved in construction, one of the things that kept popping up as Derek was talking was quality could be the disruptor. I mean, that could truly be a thing that disrupted the industry. Perhaps you as a builder in your local market or you as a tradesperson in your local market, if you really, really make quality and training and a firm commitment to that, the state of the industry is such that could be a disruptor.
The bar is low enough that there's plenty of space to come in above it and probably name your price and have plenty of work.
Yeah, it's kind of sad we're at that point, but that is the reality, and that's the opportunity that's out there. So,
absolutely.
Well, thanks so much, Seth. Another great episode of Construction Disruption, and to all of our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of Construction Disruption with special guest Derek Hodgin from Westminster, South Carolina. Derek is always, I think, one of the most informative and interesting people I get the opportunity to speak to. I encourage everyone to watch for future episodes of our podcast. Have lots of other great guests coming up, and I know we'll be talking to Derek again as well. Until then, I encourage everybody, do what you can, change the world for someone, make them smile, bring them encouragement, bring them hope. Those are some of the most powerful things that we can do to change the world one interaction at a time. So I encourage us all in that area. God bless, take care, and this is Isaiah Industries signing off until the next episode of Construction Disruption.